Obese people are not born fat, they're made fat. No genetics can make someone fat, only their environment. Okay, the root cause of obesity is insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. And in this video, I'm going to explain that to you in depth so you have a full, complete understanding of how people get so fat and how obesity has come to exist, okay? So, in this state of insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction, your energy expenditure is substantially lowered, your appetite is increased, and your body partitions more energy to fat storage, okay? So, the root cause of that is basically seed oils and linoleic acid. And linoleic acid is a type of polyunsaturated fat found in seed oils, okay, and vegetable oil. So the fat that you eat, whatever type of fat you're eating, will accumulate in your cell membranes, okay, and your mitochondrial membranes, because you got to understand all of the membranes of every cell in our body are made of fat that gets accumulated into phospholipids, which is just a combination of phosphorus and fat that basically and cholesterol that makes your membrane. Okay, so that's what keeps each of your cells as a cell. That's like how it works. Okay, so the fat that you eat will naturally be accumulated into those membranes. Okay, and there are three main key types of fat that we eat in our diet. So the first one is saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fat. Now, if you want to learn more in depth about the different types of fat and how they affect your body, then I'd highly recommend watching my video that I made on my channel not too long ago about the different fat and how it affects your body. That's really good, that video. So if you want to learn more about that, then obviously watch that. But for now, all you need to know is that due to the structure of polyunsaturated fat, they are less stable than the other fats, okay? They oxidize easily and make dangerous free radicals when exposed to oxygen, okay? So they react with oxygen because they have double bonds, which are weaker than the rest of the molecules. So they're like a weak point in the molecule where if oxygen or another molecule with oxygen interacts with it, it reacts and it breaks apart and makes a new chemical, okay? So that's the first thing. Then secondly, these such polyunsaturated fats, they weaken the proton gradient and the electron transport chain in our mitochondria. So that's the part of our cell that makes energy, of course. They weaken the proton gradient and electron transport chain. You don't really need to know exactly what that is. All you need to know is that you need a strong proton gradient and you need the electron transport chain to work properly to make as much ATP as possible, okay? So they would, like these fats, when they're in the mitochondria, when they accumulate in the mitochondrial membrane, they weaken the proton gradient and they cause electron leak, all right? Which means that you don't spin ATP synthase, which is like the protein that normally basically creates ATP. They weaken this process, so it basically damages your ability to make as much ATP because of their structure and their nature, okay? So people with highly polyunsaturated mitochondrial membranes, so they've got high amounts of polyunsaturated fat, can produce up to 90% less ATP without the cell dying. So the cell doesn't die until it's got like no energy left. So you could produce as much as 90% less than what you could, like the maximum, 90% less without the cell dying, okay? And by the way, this fact should open your eyes to like a realization that how energy works in our body is not as simple as just the number of calories you eat and the amount of calories you expend. Like it's really much deeper than that. Like the amount of ATP your mitochondria produces is actually a variable factor, okay? So in this case, when you have high amounts of polyunsaturated fat, it physically weakens your body's ability to produce ATP, okay? These polyunsaturated fats and linoleic acid in particular, like I mentioned, are super fragile to any oxidation from oxygen, heat, and metabolic activity, all right? So the mitochondria itself will naturally produce some reactive oxygen species, and that breaks down the membranes, like the fat that breaks down the linoleic acid in the membranes, okay? And it breaks their double bonds and it creates new chemicals like aldehydes, 4-HNE, and MDA and other lipid peroxides, which are basically toxic chemicals that damage your whole body, really, all right? They damage the insulin receptor, they damage the GLUT4 translocation pathway, all right? I'll explain more about that in a moment. They damage proteins, they damage DNA, they damage cellular membranes and mitochondria, okay? In a healthy human, the mitochondrial membrane would be mostly saturated and monounsaturated fat, okay? But in obese people, they have up to around 50% linoleic acid alone, right? Not to mention other polyunsaturated fat, just linoleic acid alone, up to 50% in their mitochondrial membranes, okay? Not always that high, but up to that amount, all right? And this fat makes the membrane less stable and physically weaker, all right? Like the fat itself is less stable and physically weaker, okay? The electron transport chain in the mitochondria physically gets leaky, and electrons that are supposed to be going around and spinning the ATP synthase, they leak out of the mitochondria basically, and it increases the peroxidation of the fat in the membranes, okay? Because it's leaking out and it's causing reactions, okay? So in the cell membranes, these fats and the reactive oxygen species created from them and the lipid peroxides and such that I mentioned before, they physically damage the insulin receptor and block its function. So it physically blocks GLUT4 translocation on the cell membrane, which means you physically cannot bring glucose into the cell, okay? So that's what insulin resistance is. It's when your muscle and liver, because they are the most metabolically active cells in your body, they absorb the most glucose, they use the most energy other than your brain, and then they physically store glucose as well as glycogen, okay? So those are by far the most metabolically active. That's the first cells to get insulin resistance, okay? So it blocks these fats and the reactive oxygen species in chemicals. They damage the cell membrane so that insulin receptor physically, because insulin receptor itself is like a protein, okay? It damages, it reacts with the protein, it damages it, it stops it from actually binding to insulin and transferring the signal into the cell, okay? So that's blocked due to the reactive oxygen species, and then that blocks GLUT4. GLUT4 is just a pathway that allows glucose to go from out the cell into the cell, okay? It blocks that from happening entirely, which means you can't absorb the glucose into your cells. So the cells that use glucose and are most metabolically active, like your liver and your muscles, become entirely resistant to insulin. Fat cells, however, are metabolically inactive. They barely use any energy. They barely have any mitochondria in them anyway, right? So they're producing extremely low amounts of energy because obviously they don't do anything other than store fat, all right? That's their entire purpose. Whereas like, obviously your brain cells create electricity through your neurons in your nervous system and stuff. They do all these sorts of things. Your muscle cells obviously contract, move. Your liver does heaps of different things. Like they use way more energy, whereas your fat cells literally hardly use any energy, okay? So that means less reactive oxygen species because they're not as metabolically active, and thus they remain sensitive to insulin. As well, the linoleic acid and the polyunsaturated fats make the cell membrane, like the fat cell membrane, more permeable, which is because they are less solid and they're more fragile. Like the actual structure of the fat is more like fluid basically, which basically means that glucose is absorbed easier into the cell. Okay, so basically it makes your fat cells really like they don't resist insulin. They actually become more sensitive to insulin, which means they absorb more glucose into your fat cells. Okay, because the liver and muscles that normally absorb the glucose, basically all the glucose in a healthy person like myself or anyone, right? Uh, they cannot absorb any of the glucose, which means your blood sugar, all the glucose in your blood, gets way higher because it's normally going into your muscles in your liver. Well, now it's been blocked, so now it rises. And this raises your baseline insulin levels because obviously insulin basically tracks your blood glucose and is there to store the glucose into your cells, okay? So this is hyperinsulinemia. That's just a long ass name, meaning that your insulin is, because normally you eat food, it comes up and then it will go down quite low, all right, when you're fasted. But when you have this hyperinsulinemia, it means it goes up higher, but then it stays high like all the time. So that, yeah, normal, yeah, exactly. So obese people don't absorb the glucose as quickly as a healthy person who would normally have their insulin drop, their blood sugar drop. Well, the obese people have this insulin resistance, so they don't absorb the glucose quick enough. So their insulin has to stay high all the time. And insulin, in this situation, the only cell that's actually responding to insulin, like the effects of insulin are actually working, is your fat cells. And what does insulin do in your fat cells? Well, it's the hormone that activates LPL and it blocks HSL and ATGL. So LPL is lipoprotein lipase, which is an enzyme that stores fat, all right? It physically makes your body, like your fat cells, convert glucose into fat and to absorb triglycerides and such. So basically, it makes you store fat. And HSL and ATGL, hormone sensitive lipase, and adipose triglyceride lipase, they are what would normally burn fat. So they would break down your fat cells and release fatty acids for energy, okay? Well, insulin blocks that. Whether you're healthy or not, by the way, it's not unique to obese people. Insulin always blocks fat burning. But if you have hyperinsulinemia and your fat cells are more sensitive to insulin, well, you're going to store fat rapidly because now your insulin's always high. You've got higher blood sugar and your muscle and liver aren't absorbing any of it. It's just your fat cells. And for some reason, your fat cells are absorbing more of it. All right. Like they're more sensitive to insulin. So now all of a sudden, all of that blood sugar that would normally just be going into your muscles and liver is just all of a sudden just going straight into fat. Okay. So that's what happens with insulin resistance. Now that your body is creating way less energy, less ATP, and it's using less energy because the liver and muscles are blocked. They normally use like most of the energy, really. Your metabolism slows down a lot. In insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction, your BMR, basal metabolic rate, so the amount of energy you use just to like exist, lowers by about 30%, which means that if you think you use 2,000 calories a day, like say you've done those calorie expenditure calculators online, you can search it up and you type in your height, your age, your weight, and whatever. It might say that you're using 2,000 calories, but if you have insulin resistance, you would probably only be using about 1,400 calories. Okay, and that also ties into why calorie restriction doesn't really work, because you'd have to restrict way more calories than you think you need to actually get a result. So like using this like a calorie based perspective on fat burning and such, you would have to be in at least a 600 calorie deficit just to not be gaining more fat, okay? But yeah, basically, so all your energy, you're pushing more of your body's energy that you're eating is going straight towards fat storage rather than to energy expenditure, okay? So when ATP drops in cells, right, when you're producing like 90% less ATP, like up to 90%, maybe 50% less ATP, for example, it signals pathways related to energy stress, all right? And it tells your hypothalamus in your brain that you have very low energy, which you do. You don't actually have enough energy. So, like in your cells, you have plenty in your fat, of course, as we know, but it's not in your cells. You're not producing enough energy. So, this raises your cortisol, and cortisol breaks down muscle if it's chronically elevated, like it would be in obesity, because you're not producing enough energy. So your body's always stressed metabolically. It thinks it's like it's low energy, so your cortisol gets up, and you really are gonna end up breaking down muscle like that, okay? So chronic cortisol elevation in combination with high insulin from hyperinsulinemia, and especially if you're eating carbs, like shooting your insulin up like that, leads to even more fat storage, all right? You might have heard that cortisol makes you fat. Cortisol on its own can't make you fat, okay? But when you have high insulin and then you add high cortisol, like chronic cortisol elevation, cortisol tells your body, shit, we got to store as much energy as we can. So you end up storing more fat than before, okay? So the cortisol contributes to you storing more fat, okay? So in in this state of insulin resistance, it increases by about 50 to 100% above your baseline cortisol. So that's what chronic high cortisol looks like, 50 to 100% above baseline. That's a lot. So cortisol also increases hunger. There's a hormone called leptin as well, which tells your brain how much stored energy you have in fat. It helps regulate your fertility and your sex hormone production in both men and women. And it regulates your hunger and your metabolism, like your energy expenditure to some extent. So it's telling your brain how much energy do we have in our body? Can we afford to reproduce? How much energy can we afford to use? And how much food do we need to eat? That's what it's telling your body, your brain specifically. And in healthy people, like myself or other healthy people who are lean, are sensitive to leptin, okay? So it will make them create high amounts of sex hormones that will be fertile. It will stop them from overeating, all right? That's one thing it does, and it will increase the amount of energy that you use, okay? But in hyperinsulinemia, when your insulin's always elevated, it damages the receptors in your hypothalamus and the neural circuits that read the signal. It means that you get leptin resistance, okay? And yeah, that makes you extremely hungry. Your brain thinks it's starving once again. Like, this is just another signal telling your brain we're starving, we've got no energy, okay? So it makes them extremely hungry. They think they're starving. It lowers sex hormone synthesis by making them infertile, like thus making them infertile, right? And slowing energy usage to conserve energy, okay? So it's not about discipline. It's not about eating too much calories. It's not about exercising enough. It's about their metabolism, okay? And how the body is using the energy that you eat, all right? It's about what you're eating, and it's about how it's affecting your body, okay? So this is why calorie restriction doesn't work. It's why cardio doesn't work, because none of that actually addresses the root cause of obesity and excess body fat, okay? None of that. No amount of calorie restriction is going to like directly attack that problem. So if you want to learn how to burn fat effectively and rapidly to reverse obesity, then watch my other videos, because I've literally made like dozens of videos like this that are high quality and very informative, that are on my channel, and one of them, at least one of them, refers to how you can burn fat effectively and rapidly scientifically. Okay, so watch those videos if you're more interested in that as well. And if you're fat yourself and you're watching this and you want to burn fat rapidly and effectively and get transformed, then join my community. It's the first link in the description, and I can transform you there, okay? Because that's my mission. That's what I want to accomplish right now. So feel free to join and I will transform you. Yes, it costs money, but it is absolutely worth it. I honestly believe the price tag is well under the net value that you will get out of it, okay? So please do join that if you need my help. And thanks for watching. I hope this educated you so that you actually understand how obesity works, because this is the root cause of obesity. All of that explains why obese people get to the state that they are in. It's not just they ate too much energy, because if that was the case, then like they wouldn't be that fat. Like, it's ridiculous to assume that it's just a calorie surplus that would make someone 300, 400 kilograms. Some people, like, that's not possible without these things, all right? You can even eat a calorie surplus where you're eating too much energy. Like myself, for example, like I consistently eat above 3,000 calories a day, and yet I still look shredded. I still have a six pack. I still have like my obliques showing. I'm not going to show you right now, but basically, like, it's because I'm so sensitive to insulin that my body is basically, when I eat more food, more calories from healthy, good sources, all right? Huge emphasis on that. My diet is like complete. Basically, my body just senses that there's a high amount of energy. I produce more ATP, more energy, and then my body goes crazy. It uses heaps of energy. And yeah, I don't store fat. I basically don't store fat. Now, it's not genetic, because I swear if I ate the diet that fat people eat, that obese people eat, I would just become obese like everyone else, right? It really is down to environment. It would take me like at least a year for me to accumulate enough polyunsaturated fat, enough linoleic acid into my membranes, in my muscle, my liver, every cell in my body, by the way, to get to the point when then I have insulin resistance, my mitochondria isn't working, I've got reactive oxygen species, I've got all these oxidative stress, and my insulin receptors damaged, and then all of a sudden, before you know it, I'm storing like a kilogram of fat a day or something, like, well, at least a few kilos a week of pure fat. I'm addicted to junk food, and I'm so hungry, but I'm not like using hardly any energy. That's the state that they're in, right? It really is environmental. So there's, yeah, that breaks through any cope about like genetics. Genetics can't make you obese, nor can they make you super shredded. It's just environment, okay? It's just that simple. So yeah, I hope this helps you, and good luck, bro.